the bandicoots as well on site. The overall, I guess, success or aim of the project is to have the bandicoots continue breeding on those sites and develop a self-sustaining population. So I'm just going to cover a couple of things. If you guys have any questions, please, you can interrupt me, that's fine. Everybody's hearing me okay? We'll take that.
Yes, sounds good.
All right, cool. So just a few points I'm not sure if you guys are interested in. I've sort of gone a bit into the behaviour, selecting dogs as well, since we're all dog trainers. We used a breeder that is actually quite successful in breeding working dogs. There's quite, as in any dog breed, there's sort of show line breeders as well as working line breeders, and this breeder's been breeding for quite a long time and imported quite a lot of working line dogs. We do have one show line dog that was donated to us, which is very different in behaviour. So, yep, the working line's definitely, here's our gang. I'll just flip back. We assessed the dogs about 6 weeks of age. We went out to the property and then picked them up at 8 weeks. And we looked for different things. We have an ambassador dog, Elvis, you may have heard of, that travels around with Dave. And we looked for a particular confident dog. Maremas aren't generally highly sociable. So we were looking for quite a sociable dog that wanted to investigate, display that it wanted to be with people during our visit. Whereas the working dogs, we looked for kind of the quiet, confident dogs that sat back and watched what was going on. We passed over dogs that showed any signs of fear. And of course, we looked at just overall structure and that sort of things that are going to be out in the fields. We needed dogs to be handleable. Quite often, Maremas that are left out in paddocks for stock as the usual old-fashioned kind of way are unhandleable. So we looked at that sort of thing, and we looked at our puppies as well. So we have 7 dogs currently in the team. We originally went for 4 male, 4 female. We unfortunately lost a young male at about 1.5 years of age. So we continued on with our 7. The dogs are bonded in traditional methods with their stock. So the dogs aren't guarding specifically the bandicoots on site, because bandicoots don't flock. They're what's the word? They live within a large range of they don't sort of, about 1 square kilometre you would find one bandicoot, so they don't like to group together in any way, shape or form except when breeding, so that it's not a flock that, or a group of animals that the dogs can guard. The dogs therefore need a job still, and so they're still guarding sheep, and we hope that in turn, by guarding the sheep and guarding the site and just ignoring the bandicoots, that they will keep the foxes away. The dogs do their job via several means. Disruption, so the barking, the running, there's lots of barking, lots of running when they notice something in the environment that's unusual. They will mark, so lots of urinating and defecating along boundary lines and that sort of thing to mark their territory. And some dogs will confront and actually take on a predator, so that is chase and often kill, but not all dogs will. And quite often it's not generally necessary, the barking, the marking, the lots of movement is generally all that's required. We also have at Werribee the dogs set up living alongside bandicoots. So we want the bandicoots to be there right from day dot as sort of background noise, that they see them, they smell them, that's a part of their environment. We have put together and gone through with all the dogs sort of 10 to 12-step plan to actually avoid the bandicoots when they come across them in the field setting. And we've trialled positive reinforcement with that. So generally for avoidance behaviours, as you guys might know, like with snake avoidance, generally positive punishment is used, and an aversive to teach animals to leave something alone. But the zoo wanted to trial positive reinforcement, and so I'm going to go through a little bit of our plan as well. So here's a photo of one of the young puppies. You can see on the right in the bonding area. So when they are small and I guess at a risk of being injured, the young dogs, they're housed next to the sheep as their first step. And as they all sort of get used to each other, they can live. You can see this is bigger dogs here, and you can see one sheep was grazing in the background there. And this in the background, the building or the colour-bond pen you can see, that's the Bandicoot enclosure as well. So we've got 3 Bandicoot enclosures there that the dogs, it's in the middle of all the dogs' paddocks. So the dogs are sometimes separated into 2s in separate paddocks, but they all have access to the Bandicoot enclosure. We started our weekly introductions with the dogs when they came to us at 8 weeks to develop a positive association with the Bandicoot. So that just meant them coming into the Bandicoot enclosure, having a sniff of a Bandicoot while we held it. What's happened my slide? I just want to move. Spending time just investigating the enclosures. So sometimes we would take the Bandicoot out and let the dogs just have a good sniff in there, move around and check out urination spots, nesting spots, that sort of thing. These are the windows that are on each side of the Bandicoot pen. So each pen has perspex windows with holes drilled in them that the dogs can see in. So at night time, the dogs should be able to see the Bandicoots moving about, hear and smell any sort of activity that's going on in there. And then when we get a bit more to the sort of pointy end of things and start looking at teaching behaviours, we're using operant conditioning. And the behaviour that we don't want the dogs to be operating off cues from the handler, because the end point is the dogs out in the field without handlers, living with the Bandicoots in their habitat. We're not going to be there to give them cues, so we really don't want them operating off our cues. So we're marking natural behaviour that we see from the dogs, and reinforcing the behaviour that we like. So the initial thing that we taught was just some impulse control. So we used a leave it cue. We just taught that as you would with food in the hand. Teach your dog to leave it and not take it, wait for it. And then we added that leave it cue to a rabbit. And we used a rabbit basically because the Bandicoots are pretty flighty. And we had a rabbit available to us who was a pretty chill dude. And I guess they're similar size, similar way of moving. So we could pop the rabbit in a hutch and let the dogs come right up and have a really close sniff. And then we would at first give our leave it cue, which they knew from the food, and if they looked or moved away, basically reinforce it. And then that cue was dropped really quickly so that they weren't relying on it. Once they had looked away or moved away once or twice, then we just started waiting for them to actually offer it, which they did really quickly. So once we got the dogs offering the moving away or looking away behaviour for reinforcement, we started to apply that impulse control with the Bandicoot. And the first stage was the Bandicoot wrapped in what we call a catch bag, the cotton breathable bags that we weigh animals in, transport animals in, that sort of thing. So we'd have a Bandicoot secured in the bag and just let the dogs have a sniff. They already know the smell of a Bandicoot. They've been meeting them from a young age, and then just reward the looking or moving away. So this is some photos of some of the stages we went through when the dogs would be either on lead or muzzled if they were off lead, and then they move through stages when we feel we can trust the dogs, then either the lead or the muzzles are removed. You can see here. And we wanted to generalize the behaviour to different environments, so they didn't think that we just had to ignore a Bandicoot inside a Bandicoot enclosure. And that then went on to, obviously, if we move the Bandicoot out in the calico bag, they still see the calico bag. And so then we started hiding the actual bag. So all they were getting then was the scent of the bandicoot, which would be similar to if they came across a bandicoot in a paddock that was nesting. You wouldn't see no sign of it, but obviously smell it. And we also did some generalising to bandicoots at night. It's when you're going to come across them. And we did that at Woodlands Historical Park. Got permission from Parks Vic to take the dogs out there and walk them on long leads at night. This is one of our paddocks. You can see the bandicoot hidden under some leaves there in the calico bag. And then we've got areas of grassland areas where we could actually hide bandicoot completely, and the dogs could happen upon them when they were walking in there with us. And then we would reward for any behaviour, moving, marking where they were and then moving away. So then the next thing we wanted to look at was the dogs when they see a moving bandicoot. So they're sort of getting used to the idea of if I smell one in a nest, I leave it alone. And then we also need to prove that if they see one running about, they still leave it alone. So we would wake the bandicoot up, take the dogs in, and again reinforce that behaviour of looking away or moving away. You can see here Primo and Curly and Bandicoot, and that might be Dyson in the front of the photo. The dogs got quite good at it. Some of them would offer lying down behaviour. We didn't ask for that behaviour or cue it. Some of the dogs just naturally would offer it. Some will just stand still and freeze when they see a bandicoot. Others will turn their head away, and some will turn and walk away. So again, we're rewarding the behaviours they offer as long as it's not moving towards the bandicoot. So our field sites that the dogs will be deployed to, we've got 3 field sites, Murrumong, about 80 hectares in Skipton. We have 2 dogs currently out there at the moment. I'll go a bit more into that. We have Dunkeld, the pastoral company has donated us 60 hectares. And we have dogs deployed there just in the last week. And Tiverton will be our last field site, which you may also know will be the largest feral-proof area on mainland when they seal up their fencing. We've got a small 50 hectares corner of that area where we can have dogs and bandicoots. So we deployed our first set of dogs to Murrumong in April 2018. It was Curly and Primo, the 2 dogs you saw in that photo with the bandicoot. We have collars on the dogs, GPS collars, and GPS collar on at least one of the sheep to see if dogs are staying with sheep. So the dogs went out with 5 of their sheep that they'd been bonded with from a young age. And you can see the GPS collars in this little diagram here, where there's a big group of data points all together is where the feed station was at that point. So the dogs are spending time there, but then you can see they're covering quite a bit of the site. Our first lot of data that we got from Linda, I don't have dates, it's all pre-published data at the moment, so but it's interesting to have a look at. So before the dogs went out, you can see this hotspot of fox activity in the lower, so the southwest side in the corner there, and that's that little corner is where there's a corner of 2 of the incoming roads intersect at that corner. And we set up there, so post dogs, if you look at that diagram, we actually set the dogs up in that corner with their kennels and feed station, that sort of thing, when they first went onto the site. And we can see that the hotspot of fox activity moved up north. That was probably over a couple of months, that data taken. We weren't entirely happy with the dog's behaviour because that little spot where we set up is the corner of the incoming road. They spend a lot of time sitting there waiting for visitors to come and feed them and just watching, like, I guess, the daily activity of the staff that work at Murrumong. So we decided to move the dogs up to that northern corner, and you can see there we moved them, when we did move them up to that northern corner, we got the foxes dispersed into other areas again. So we felt that the dogs weren't covering enough of the site. Obviously, where they are impacts fox activity, but not enough that we felt comfortable releasing bandicoots. So we looked at our setup and looked at what we could do to change things up a bit to increase site coverage from the dogs. And we felt that our 5 Dorper, who were very large and very well-doers, Dorper don't need to eat a lot, and they was kind of hanging in whatever spot was nice and out of the wind and had heaps of food, and the sheep weren't moving a lot, so the dogs were doing their job and staying with the sheep. We added a 3rd dog, a younger dog as well, to see if that would help increase site coverage. And we leased some sheep from Mirrabong and decided to increase the number of sheep in the thought that the sheep would keep moving once they had finished eating in a certain area. They would keep moving rather than now 5 sheep that have got plenty of food in one spot. Unfortunately, after several months of trying to bond the sheep with their dogs, we had issues with the sheep just not taming down. We decided to pull the dogs out and go away and come up with a new plan. The new plan, I guess, involved getting sheep that had no dog experience. So those 80 sheep that we received from Mirrabong were old sheep that generally were no longer breeding, but that had plenty of experience being herded by working dogs. So we felt that that was impacting them taming down. Our area, we had one trough as a water supply, and it was quite hot at the time of bonding, and the dogs, we think, were guarding the water supply. Being Maremmas, they often get it into their head to guard all sorts of things: food, water, mates, shelter. So we had to look at the design, make it larger, put in multiple water sources, make sure dogs weren't fed in with sheep at all. So we changed quite a few things in the setup. And then when we went back in August last year, we decided to change our selection process for the dogs. The dogs that we selected the first time were the ones that we felt were best with bandicoots, whereas the second time around we chose the dogs that we felt were best with sheep for bonding with the new group. And they've all done really well. So we went with Curly and Quinta. This is one of some photos in the bonding yard. It's a nice big yard with our group of wethers. They did great, and then they're now all released on Mirrabong and have free reign of the 80 hectares. And as I said, we are at the stage now, we haven't got our data back from Lydia yet, so there'll be 6 months in total of data collected again before we look at fox activity. And in the meantime, we've deployed 2 more dogs to Dunkeld. We again have a small group of sheep, and we'll have to see how we go with the movement of the sheep. On that property, we have a different idea of getting the sheep to move, where we'll actually move the water source, or actually we have multiple water sources across the property, and we can turn on and off the water sources to try and get the sheep moving between water sources. The dogs are currently being walked on long lines daily to acclimatise them to the native wildlife out there. And then we hope to have Tiverton online towards the end of the year, possibly early next year. And Tiverton's sort of a bit more of an open grassland, so we'll probably again have to reassess how we manage dogs out there. So that's where we're at. If anyone would like to ask any questions, please feel free.
Awesome, thanks, Lydia. I'll ask a question.
Sure.
With some of these big sites, just looking at that photo you've got on the screen now.
Yeah.
I can see why sheep aren't moving around that property.
That's right. There's lots of food there. Yeah.
So is there a way, I know with pet sheep and sheep I've always had at home, you could rattle a bucket and they'll go to where the grain and better food is other than the grass. Is there a way of moving the sheep through feeding?
Yeah,
changing in
look, I
feeding
think at
schedules?
Dunkeld we will have that opportunity. The sheep there are sort of a mixed bunch of some hand-reared sheep and some sheep from different properties in the neighbourhoods and things like that, and they're taming up really well for and coming for pallets. The wethers at Miramong, we got them as yearlings, so they don't have really any experience with dogs, which is great. It's what we wanted, but they're pretty shy from people as well. They are spreading out a lot across the Miramong site, which is, we think, a good thing because they're wethers. They don't flock as much as ewes do. They're spreading out in smaller groups, and from what we can see, the dogs are moving from group to group. So that looks like it's working well. We've got to get some GPS back on that to confirm. And because the hard thing is with the flock breaking up is we've got collars on 2 sheep, but the dogs might not necessarily be with the sheep that have the collars on because they're all in different areas. So we might not get great data of if the dogs are with sheep, but we'll get good data of where the dogs are and if they're moving around more.
What are you using to find the fox or established fox presence and absence?
So Linda's got about 60 camera traps on each site. So she's got that set up on, so for example, on Miramong, and then within 5Ks we've got a control site. She's got about the same size site and the same number of cameras.
Okay.
She is using a lure setup as well a couple of times a year. So she buries at varying depths chicken necks where the cameras are, and then measures how long the foxes are spending there digging. So the idea behind that is if the foxes feel very comfortable in the environment, they'll dig right down to the deep ones and get them out. If they're not feeling comfortable because there's dogs around or other things that are interrupting them, then they might not stop and dig at all, or they might just dig out the top layer and then get going.
Yeah.
So we can see also whether they're there, and then also how much time they're willing to spend in the environment, which goes back to what I was saying about they don't necessarily have to all disappear, but if we can show that they're not willing to spend the time there hunting or scavenging, then that also is a positive sign. We've also had in Canada development to do fox scat surveys and look at individuals and that sort of thing as well. So there's a bit of a multi-pronged approach there to looking at fox numbers.
Okay.
Anything else?
It's me again, Lydia. I'll just keep asking questions if other people don't. So jump in, everybody. So what's the criteria for deciding that you're ready to put the bandicoots out there?
Yeah.
At what point will you give it a go?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there is actually like a definitive answer on that. Obviously, those heat maps are just one way of looking at things and just seeing where the foxes are. We'll have to get, I'm not sure how Linda is going to analyse that data in the long run to give us a definitive answer. That's something that her and Mike McGrath and other team members at WCS will have to decide. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't give you an exact answer on how the data is going to be used. But yeah, I've always been told as long as the fox activity is decreased, it doesn't have to be completely gone, that we will give it a go.
And apart from the penguins,
yes,
or about the penguins even, how successful has this been on small species like this? Is there other examples where it has worked?
Yeah, literally that's it with guardian dogs. I mean, there's guardian dogs have been used like on other conservation programs, but in a different way, I guess. They're being used to directly guard the stock that they're trying to protect, like, so, you know, cheetah outreach and that sort of thing. are using guardian dogs overseas to guard farming livestock, so more of a traditional usage, and that in turn then stops farmers shooting wildlife and that sort of thing. So they've been used really successfully in that way, but to directly protect a smaller target species, the only other program has been Warrnambool. And that again is very different. So the island's pretty small, I'm not sure if you've seen it. And the dogs just stay up on a boardwalk. So they're not actually with the penguins, if that makes sense, not physically with the penguins. The penguins all nest underneath the boardwalk and come and go as they please, whereas the dogs are kind of confined to a certain area. They're not intermixing with each other. So there was also another one tried at Point Danger with that Dave worked on with gannets. And there were other issues there where the gannets became really comfortable with the dogs and started regurgitating for the dogs and feeding them. And then the dogs kind of, like this is when they're nesting, the breeding season, I guess they were all broody, and we started feeding the dogs, and then the dogs saw the gannets as a kind of, well, you're providing me with food, and then dogs started eating eggs as well. So that one, the pin was pulled, didn't go so well. And this will be the next one. So there's nothing really else to compare it to that I know of, and that's why it's kind of a really
So I guess the closest sort of working example is chicken farms, for instance.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but again, that's different because the chickens are all together in the flock. Do you know what I mean? So, but yes, in terms of like dogs protecting smaller species, yes, they do really well on chicken farms. Yeah. But in
But
terms
you think
of
perhaps that flocking behaviour really influences?
Yeah, that's right. It is flocking behaviour. It is definitely, they're bonded with the chickens from a young age the way our dogs are bonded with the sheep. So they're imprinted on them, I guess. Whereas our dogs have had lots of interaction with the bandicoots, but I don't know if they'd be imprinted on them, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Is there any of your research looking at the feral cats and the impact these dogs may have in that area on feral cat?
Well, basically everything that comes through the camera traps is recorded, and I believe there have been a few cats seen, but doesn't seem to be a large concern in the areas we're in.
Right.
Yeah, and bandicoots have been released. So just recently at French Island have been released, and there's still cats on that population. There's domestic cats and that sort of thing, and the cats don't seem to be having a huge impact on those populations.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you see any avenues for threatened species in this? You've got, like, if it is successful with the eastern barred bandicoot,
Yeah.
is there a longer term plan for other species?
Oh, look, definitely, and I think that's one of the exciting things about it. And you know, we've had lots of unforeseen things happen because it's such a novel approach, I guess. And you know, just things like us thinking we could put 5 sheep out with the dogs and not realizing the sheep weren't going to move. You know, so there's been stumbling blocks and things like that along the way, and it's but if we can prove that this works, it could be applied to many species. So yeah, I think if we can just prove that the dogs, which we do know that, you know, Linda's done her PhD already with guardian dogs, and there's really good data out there that they do work well at excluding wild dogs, foxes and other predators. So the main thing then is that they leave the target species alone, and they're not causing issues there with the target species themselves, I guess.
I've heard this come up at a few of our conversations, well, not necessarily between you and I, but talking about guardian dogs in general, about the idea of creating an island using dogs. So having the dogs in paddocks circling a central paddock where your target species may be?
Yes.
That's something that's considered?
Definitely. So that, I guess, is similar to the Warrnambool Middle Island approach of the dogs aren't necessarily with the target species. That, you know, Middle Island's small enough that you basically, the dogs are up there in the middle of the island, and they can bark and mark and do whatever they need to do. The island's that small that they, you know, any fox looking to get on the island is not going to want to come that close. And so we have looked at, yeah, like you said, creating a moat or an outer ring around land. Again, just whether that's practical, fencing wise, depending on the size of the land, that sort of thing, but it's definitely doable. And that was kind of going to be, if all else fails, if we had issues with the dogs and the target species or other wildlife, that could be our sort of last ditch effort to still use the dogs, is to create that barrier with dogs on the outside. Yep.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions from other people out there?
I've wowed you all.
You have.
Yes.
Was that another question?
No.
Well, I think that's great. I can't wait to see what happens with this project, Lydia.
Yeah,
I'm really excited.
It's been a long, like, sort of sometimes slow slog. There's been challenges without anything to kind of base what we're doing off. You know, there's no recipe to follow. So quite often there's lots of conversations where we're just trying to nut things out. Yeah, it will be really interesting to see how it goes.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.